The air inside the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, felt thick not from the humidity outside, but from something heavier, an unspoken truth that had seeped into these walls over the decades. The ancient oak doors, which knew all the courtroom secrets, seemed to know how things worked here, too. At the center of it all was Judge Meredith Langford. In her 24 years on the bench, she had built an unshakable presence. Her reading glasses were rarely lowered, but when she looked up from them, her piercing eyes were enough to silence any lawyer. Her voice was never loud, but the authority within them crushed any objection. Langford left a legacy that was not etched in stone, nor taught in law schools, but was spoken of in whispers in hallways and in private discussions among lawyers. Black lawyers, in particular, knew exactly what to expect when they entered this courtroom. Her rulings seemed to be skewed in one direction, and her every move followed a pattern that no one could prove but everyone knew. Today, that pattern was about to be tested. Darnell Hayes walked into the courtroom. His polished shoes echoed on the marble floor, each step conveying confidence and determination. At 48, Darnell was a renowned defense attorney who had built his career on taking cases that no one else would. His reputation extended far beyond Alabama, and his ability to disrupt the prosecution's arguments made him a thorn in the side of judges like Langford. Today, he was more than just a defense attorney. Today, he brought something Langford had not anticipated. As he walked to the defense table, Darnell noticed Mrs. Langford's eyes on him. It wasn't anger about the case, it was personal. Not about what he'd done or said, but simply about who he was. In that moment, Darnell felt the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about proving the innocence of Tyrone Wilkes, a man wrongly accused of armed robbery. This was a much bigger fight. And today, everything would change. Darnell sat still, her hands still clutching her briefcase, her eyes fixed on Judge Langford as she scanned the file before her, her expression cold as if he were an insignificant part of the room. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dry and unenthusiastic. "You're walking on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." Darnell kept his face impassive. "I'll try not to dishonor you." Judge Langford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good. Because I have a full schedule and I don't need pomposity." She turned to the prosecutor, where Philip Calloway, a newly minted assistant district attorney, ambitious but inexperienced, sat with a smug look on his face. "The state is ready, sir," Calloway said, his eyes flashing over Darnell with smugness. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Darnell's client sat beside him, hunched over, shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. He had been in the system too long, seen too much, heard too much, lost too much. Darnell leaned in, his voice clear and calm. "We're ready." Judge Langford exhaled, almost an impatient sigh. "Let's get this over with," she announced, and the trial began. But this wasn't a trial, it was a show, and Judge Langford was the star. Darnell's every objection was dismissed almost immediately. Every time Calloway stumbled, she patiently guided him, like a teacher correcting a favorite student. The courtroom noticed. The jury noticed. But no one dared say anything. Except Darnell. He was used to hostile courtrooms, but this was different. Judge Langford didn't even bother to hide her bias. Every time he spoke, she interrupted. Every time he made a reasonable argument, she waved it away like it was an annoyance. The rhythm of the courtroom became clear. The prosecutor spoke, the judge agreed, and the jury, who were supposed to be the voice of impartiality, just sat there, silent. But Darnell wasn't silent. And he had no intention of leaving this courtroom. Judge Langford had already decided on a verdict before the trial began. Darnell couldn't ignore the tension in the courtroom. He could tell by the way the jury was shifting in their seats. Even some of the white jurors, who might have come with fixed ideas, couldn't hide their unease at what was happening. But Judge Langford didn't care. She seemed to be deliberately making things worse. Her voice grew sharper each time she interrupted Darnell. "Mr. Hayes, you're testing my patience." Her voice was cold and warning. "Mr. Hayes, if you raise one more unfounded objection, I will hold you in contempt." Every word she spoke was like a knife, but Darnell kept his face calm. Inside, his blood boiled, not at the insults, but at the obvious injustice. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "the prosecution has just introduced evidence that was not disclosed during discovery. This is a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate new trial." The courtroom held its breath, all eyes on Langford. She leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with an expression of exaggerated boredom. Darnell let the silence drag on, then pressed again, "Your Honor, are you pleading guilty to a Brady violation?" Langford's face was expressionless, but her voice was icy. "I said pleading guilty, Mr. Hayes." The mood in the room changed dramatically. The reporters wrote faster, the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. She saw it. Her eyes darkened. "You are very close to being held in contempt, Mr. Hayes." But Darnell did not back down. "Your Honor, I simply ask that the court follow the law." Langford's gavel came down hard, echoing throughout the room. "Enough. One more word and I will remove you from this courtroom." The room fell dead silent. Darnell could hear his heart pounding, but he didn't worry. This was exactly what he needed. From the dock, his client, Tyrone Wilkes, clenched his fists under the table, as if to send a message, "Don't let her do this to you." Darnell sat still, his cold eyes betraying no emotion. He muttered something, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't even glance at Langford. "I have nothing left, sir," he said softly, and sat back down, his expression still impassive. Langford smirked, acting as if she had won. But what she didn't realize was that the game had just begun, and she was in his grasp. Darnell sat still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. He knew when to push, when to pull back, just enough to let someone self-destruct. And Judge Langford did. In the tense moment, the judges exchanged glances, a few glancing toward the gallery, where reporters were scribbling in their notebooks. Everyone sensed something was changing, an unease in the air, the exposure of a power abused. The roar of a judge who had grown too comfortable with his own power. But Langford didn't back down. She sat up straighter, her eyes cold and her voice sharp. "Mr. Calloway, continue with your question." Philip Calloway cleared his throat, clearly flustered. He was young but not stupid, he could see the change, too. "Yes, sir." He turned to the witness stand, where a shaky-eyed store clerk Saturday, "Mr. Thomas, can you confirm that the defendant Tyrone Wilkes is the person you saw at the scene of the robbery?" The older man hesitated. Darnell leaned forward, recognizing the hesitation of someone who wasn't sure what they'd been trained to say. But Langford paid no attention to it. "Answer the question," she pressed. The witness flinched. I think so," he said finally. Darnell stood up immediately. "Objection, sir. That is not a definite statement." Langford didn't even hesitate. "Deny." Darnell exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, just enough to get the jury's attention. He let Calloway deal with a few more questions before taking the stand. Darnell approached the witness stand, his voice quiet but sharp. "Mr. Thomas, you say you think you saw my client that night. How certain are you?" The man licked his lips, clearly uncomfortable. "I think I saw him, but you're not sure." Langford interrupted before the witness could answer. "Go ahead, Mr. Hayes." Darnell turned her head slowly, her eyes locked on Judge Langford. Needless to say, it was too obvious, too obvious. He emphasized each word, "I want the witness to answer." "Your Honor, I have." "Go ahead." Darnell didn't blink. "Defend your honor." "You are preventing the witness from clarifying his statement," Langford interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. Her face twitched, a rare sign of unease. "I warn you, Hayes." Darnell smiled only slightly, a smile that was enough to provoke. "I understand, Your Honor." He turned back to the witness, but said nothing more. "No further questions," Darnell said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Then he turned back to the defense table, walking slowly and deliberately. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed, the tension tightened, like a string about to snap. Langford realized she was losing control. And Darnell knew it was time. He wasn't just here to win this case, he was here to finish her off. Darnell opened his briefcase, fingers skimming through the stack of papers, searching for the one thing that would change everything. But before he could take it out, the courtroom door swung open. The sound was enough to draw all eyes away from the witness stand. 2 federal agents in black suits entered, their movements sharp and purposeful. The courtroom fell into an oppressive silence. Darnell didn't move. He simply straightened his tie and folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Langford's eyes flashed with confusion, then quickly turned to alarm. She spoke, but this time without her usual certainty. "What's the point of this?" One of the agents, a tall man with a cool demeanor, stepped forward, flashing his badge. "Judge Meredith Langford, we need to speak to you immediately." Langford's jaw tightened. "I'm in the middle of a trial." The agent didn't back down. "This is urgent." Darnell saw, for a moment, fear flash across Langford's face, before she buried it under her usual mask of arrogance. She squared her shoulders, trying to maintain her authority. "This is completely inappropriate. Whatever this is, it must wait until I finish this procedure." The second agent stepped forward, his voice ringing out to the entire courtroom. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the jury, sworn to be impartial, could not hide its curiosity. Darnell sat still, watching quietly. He knew the real battle was just beginning. Philip Calloway, the prosecutor, cleared his throat awkwardly. Should we take a break, sir?" Langford's fingers curled into the bench. "No." Her voice was as sharp as a knife. "We do not have a recess. The defense has already wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to grant it." "Judge Langford," the first advocate interrupted, his voice strained. "We have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp rippled through the room. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Langford had lost control of his courtroom. Darnell let the moment breathe, let its weight permeate every corner. Then, slowly and deliberately, he stood, turned, looked at the jury, the gallery, the reporters writing furiously. Then, finally, he faced her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I believe you have just denied my motion for a new trial. But it seems this trial is the least of your concerns right now." Langford's face paled. The lead attorney stepped forward, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "Meredith Langford, you are under arrest on suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal civil rights." The room erupted. The gallery erupted with voices, some shocked, some delighted, some utterly stunned. The jurors sat still, their eyes darting back and forth between Darnell and the woman on the bench. Langford looked at the agents, then at the warrant, then at Darnell, and for the first time, she really saw him. He was no longer the ordinary lawyer arguing in front of her. He was the man who had been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Hayes," Langford's voice was no longer sharp. It was shaky. Darnell picked up his briefcase, stepped forward, and locked eyes with her. "I told you," he said. She said, her voice calm but sharp. "I follow the law even when it is unfair to people like me." The lead agent stepped to the bench. "Judge, we need you to stand." She didn't move. Then finally, she stood. As the agents locked her handcuffs, the clang of metal echoed throughout the courtroom. And people weren't just watching. They were witnessing a reckoning. But this wasn't over yet. Judge Meredith Langford had ruled this courtroom for 24 years, wielding power with an iron fist. The lawyers feared her, the defendants knew they had no chance. The system had protected her for decades, turning a blind eye to thinly veiled bias and contempt. But now Langford stood where she had condemned countless men before. Her wrists were bound, her eyes were panicked. The air in the courtroom was electric, tense, and no one had seen this moment coming. The jury, the gallery, even Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had been eager to please her, all fell into stunned silence. Darnell Hayes let the moment drag on. He had built patiently, gathering evidence, bribes, unethical verdicts, rigged cases. He played the long game, knowing that one day Langford's corruption would become too deep to hide. And today was that day. A federal agent pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and began reading the charges aloud. "Meredith Langford, you are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial discretion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Langford finally found her voice, hissing, "Nonsense." But the agent remained calm, unblinking. "You may discuss that with your attorney." The courtroom erupted, reporters jostling to record every detail, Langford shaking hands, the way her authority was waning. She turned to Darnell, her voice hoarse with anger and disbelief. "You. Is this your business?" Darnell lifted his chin slightly, his voice calm but powerful. "This is justice." And for the first time in Langford's career, the balance of power had shifted. She tried to regain her composure, but to no avail. The power she had held for so long had slipped away. The irony was hard to miss. The woman who had once preached responsibility and obedience to the law was now facing the very thing she had preached. Langford stood there, a long moment, before the very system she had abused for so many years. She was no longer the one in power, giving orders from the bench, but now a defendant, one paying for her actions. The agents stood on either side, gently but firmly, guiding her toward the door. And then, a final insult. The one who opened the door for her was none other than the court official who had served under her, who had bowed to her orders without question. He held the door open, his eyes cold, wordless. And Langford, proud as she was, could not help but recognize the significance of the gesture. She hesitated, then stepped through. The door slammed behind her, and just like that, she was gone. The courtroom fell silent. No one dared to breathe. The weight of what had just happened seemed to weigh down on everyone. Darnell exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the defense table. Beside him, Tyrone Wilkes, the man he had defended throughout the trial, turned, looking surprised and frightened. "I thought people like her never paid for what they did," Tyrone muttered, shaking his head. Darnell glanced at the empty judge's bench, a tired but satisfied glint in his eye. "They're paying, eventually. But the real lesson is yet to come." The courtroom had never been so alive. Murmurs of conversation began to erupt. Some were skeptical, others could barely contain their satisfaction. The jury looked at each other, as if confirming that they had indeed witnessed something unprecedented. Darnell stood still, feeling the thrill of the moment. He had fought through many trials, but this was different. This was a triumph of patience and persistence, of years of gathering evidence, waiting for Langford to make one final mistake. And now, justice had been served. But Tyrone Wilkes was still handcuffed. Langford was gone, but her legacy remained. There were battles to be fought. Darnell turned, his eyes falling on Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had been confident to the point of arrogance when he stood under Langford's protection. Now he was pale, his hands clutching the edge of his notebook as if it were his only life raft in the storm. Darnell cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the substitute judge, who had been hastily summoned from another courtroom to take over the unprecedented proceedings. "We have work to do. I move to dismiss all charges against my client immediately." The new judge, a black man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, clasped his hands together and listened with the calm that only years of experience can bring. "On what grounds?" he asked. Hayes Darnell turned to the jury. "On the grounds that this entire trial was poison from the start. Judge Langford's arrest proves what we've known all along, she was never impartial, and neither was her ruling. This case was manipulated, evidence was ignored, and my client never received a fair trial." He let those words sink into the silence of the courtroom, then turned back to the judge. "And now the woman who orchestrated this injustice is in handcuffs. All that remains is to undo the damage she has done." The new judge leaned back, studying Darnell with measured patience, then nodded slowly. "I agree." A heavy silence filled the room. Then the charges against Tyrone Wilkes were dismissed. The court officer released the restraints. For a second, no one moved. Then Tyrone let out a sigh he had held for years. The officer unlocked the handcuffs, and for the first time in a long time, Tyrone's hands were his own again. The moment was so emotionally charged that even Prosecutor Calloway didn't object. He just sat there, staring at his desk, looking like a man who had lost something much bigger than a trial. Tyrone rubbed his wrists and turned to Darnell. His voice dropped. "I don't even know what to say." Darnell patted him on the shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. Because today, the justice system actually worked, not because it was built that way, but because someone fought to make it happen." Tyrone stood looking around the courtroom, which had seemed to have swallowed him whole the entire time. Then, without another word, he walked out. Darnell followed, the weight of what had just happened pressing against his chest. Because this wasn't just about Tyrone. This was about every case Langford had ever ruled on, every innocent man she'd sent away, every bribe she'd accepted, every biased judgment she'd made. This was just the beginning. Darnell had a victory today. But tomorrow, he had to work. Because there were more Langfords out there. And he's not done yet if you believe in true justice. In holding power accountable, don't just watch, let your voice be heard. Like, comment and subscribe.